Hey, hi everyone. So good to see you all. My name is Katie Waters, and welcome to the final installment of the Peace Primers for Peace at COP28. This is a series brought to you by a community of practice that is looking to raise awareness about peace and conflict sensitivity within the COP28 process, which is now, of course, upon us, which is exciting. I'm not here to say much, just to say welcome and let you all know that the session is being recorded. And I'm also here if you have any tech questions. And yeah, but without further ado, I'm thrilled to be handing the mic over to Natasha Karmi, who at the Geneva Water Hub, who will kick off the session. Natasha, over to you.
Thank you, Katie. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. As Katie mentioned, my name is Natasha Karmi, and together with four of my colleagues at the Geneva Water Hub, we're hosting this last series of the webinar, the Peace Pieces, that has so far explored like different topics and angles as they are related to peace, conflict, and climate change. Today, with all of you, we will explore how sharing and sparing water for peace contributes to climate change action, builds a community resilience in peace, ensures climate resilience in conflict settings, and provides an entry point for dialogues. So why us? Allow me first to introduce who we are for those who are unfamiliar with our organization. The Geneva Water Hub is a center of competence on water for peace that is based both at the University of Geneva and the Geneva Graduate Institute. We are a water science diplomacy center, and the core of our mandate is actually the political dimension of water cooperation. So ultimately, all that we do is to feed into political processes, whether we do that through skilled diplomacy, highest quality research, engaging training, and groundbreaking jurisprudence and policy. So how is Water for Peace relevant to a conference of the parties of the UNFCCC, you might be asking? Sadly, we are experiencing dark times in the history of humanity with an increasing number of conflicts in which water is weaponized and rules of war are disrespected. So fragile states in conflict are also those that are affected mostly by climate change. And although we all know that environmental factors alone are rarely the cause of conflicts, yet water can actually be used for peace when we expand our definition of peace beyond the absence of conflict to the conditions under which people can thrive and innovate with pride and justice. Our webinar today is to address the politics to get to peace. Why politics? Because water is political and so is climate change, yet politics is ignored in water specifically and environmental peace building more generally. Politics is the elephant in the room and it needs to be addressed. Any kind of technical cooperation, be it on water or for the mitigation and adaptation to climate change, is only as successful as to how much it feeds into proper political processes. So in the next half hour, my colleagues and myself will speak to the interplay and the relationship between politics, law, and technical issues on environmental and water cooperation. This is as relevant between states as it is at the local level or in intersections with non-state actors. Especially during these times, this interplay is important to understand to be able to find solutions to adaptation and mitigation of climate change in conflict-affected areas. I will pass on the floor to my colleague Laura Turley to share how Water for Peace can contribute to effective climate change action. On to you, Laura.
Thank you, Natasha. I will just share my screen now with a short PowerPoint to accompany. Let me see here. Oh. Okay. So thanks very much, Natasha, and to the organizers. It's great to have a chance to be part of this series. We've actually been, following and participating in other sessions, really benefiting from it as well. So it's great to also have a turn to contribute some of our thinking and some of the things that we've been working on, which are pertinent. So we're really pleased to be here, especially now with the official opening of COP28 happening today. So I am going to essentially talk a little bit about a policy brief, which we've just launched today. So it's a bit of a soft launch for some of our thinking on water for peace and climate change. So the policy brief, and we can share, after the presentation, I'll share a link in the chat. It's called Water for Peace, What Contributions to Climate Change Action? And just in terms of the background, we, as being working principally in the water sector, at least historically, most of us, we've kind of being kind of subsumed by climate change activity, climate change framing, climate change discussions. And so it was, while it had kind of been a part of our work, we realized we need to maybe more explicitly engage and figure out what our value added is. So really that's the kind of the point of some of this reflection is where can we add value to obviously this incredibly important issue area, but also add value in a way that builds from our learning, what we stand for, and can kind of contribute, even if that means in a kind of critical way. So it's the result of just meetings, internal reflections from the experts at the Geneva Water Hub over the past 6 months. And it was originally kind of planned to be mostly an internal resource, but we're also happy to be sharing it as well of potential interest to water, climate, and peace communities. So it's a short policy brief. The first part goes through a bit of a mapping exercise on some of the existing perspectives on water and climate. So it's really, it comes from a review of the literature and also just kind of a collective awareness and discussion of what we've been seeing over the past decade. And so I have 3 different groups or sort of perspectives on this slide, and I'll just go through now and explain each one and what we mean by each one. And I'd obviously be happy to hear how this resonates for you, either in a Q&A or offline sometime. But the first group here is kind of called the climate security perspective. And this is part of the broader kind of security or securitization framing, which is about the fact that security threats can come from things outside of geopolitics. They can come also from environmental factors like resource degradation and like scarcity. So the primary narrative here is the idea that water leads to conflict. Water scarcity leads to conflict. Water degradation can lead to conflict. And then we have within this various degrees of kind of digging in terms of what is the pathway or what is the connections, things like via migration, via competition for resources, via armed groups that take advantage of the scarcity situation. And in the water sector, it's kind of a familiar perspective to us in the sense that for decades now, we've been hearing about water wars and this idea that water will be the oil of the future and will lead to wars. We're also a bit wary of this perspective because that hasn't really panned out. And in terms of kind of the empirical evidence of this kind of deterministic thinking, it's not always, A doesn't always lead to B. But that being said, there's definitely within this school of thought, there's increasingly more and more nuance about exactly what these pathways are, because it's the sort of thing that it's sort of a determinism that doesn't always hold up empirically. It's a pretty prominent position of the UN and notably the UN Security Council, who discuss climate security issues with frequency. And yeah, again, like I just mentioned, we see it evolving into incorporating more and more kind of contextual issues as well. The second perspective I'd like to discuss is the water-related adaptation. And here it's this realization or confirmation that climate change is primarily felt through the water cycle. So we know about, through droughts and floods is what we hear about the most. And indeed, that is a very clear manifestation of the challenges posed by climate change. So this kind of perspective drives a recognition that water should come to the top of the adaptation agenda because this is how climate change is felt. And so, for example, in the coming days and weeks, they'll be discussing the global goal on adaptation. And there's recent research that shows that majority of all climate adaptation actions that have been recorded ever, by far the most are kind of water projects or water interventions. So that maybe doesn't really surprise us, but I think it is a strong message that they're sending to climate change negotiations. So some of the most ardent advocates of this position, such as the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, for example, they argue that we need to kind of be throwing all of our efforts behind adaptation because this is the main show in town. And this is where we can really come together and secure financing and work on water issues as well. So then there's also a high degree of kind of, I would say, sophistication and thoughtfulness coming from this sector in the sense that there's a focus on both local and global aspects, really local adaptation, local how to measure, how to implement, and then also a recognition of the global or cascading effects of climate change. So, a drought that affects a crop in one part of the world can have repercussions on food prices and food availability in other parts of the world. The third cluster or perspective that I'd like to discuss are the underlying social vulnerabilities, we kind of refer to it as. And this one is the group that's maybe the perspective that's the most cautious or critical. And that, as you say here, social, political, and economic vulnerabilities underlie most water crises, regardless of climate change. So the focus is on underlying vulnerabilities. And it's important for this perspective to really focus on that as a context for understanding how climate change events or water events will play out. So things like access and ownership and tenure, mining and agriculture, and whether or not there are the investment contracts that are underway are fair, equality and inequality in society. So by no means is this perspective denying climate change, but it's really much more clearly relegating it to the exacerbating factor role. And climate change is just one of many perspectives, one of many underlying issues. So just final point to make on this slide is that, of course, just grouping them into three here has been a helpful way for us to understand the landscape, but of course they overlap in many ways. And notably, both the climate security perspective and water-related adaptation perspective do have strong components which recognize underlying social vulnerabilities, such as the adaptation focus on needing to bring financing and attention to fragile states, as well as climate security as well. And like I mentioned, climate security becoming increasingly nuanced perspective as well. So the second part of this policy brief goes through some of the contributions of the Geneva Water Hub. So the first part here is about nurturing the peace piece. And so water challenges, we recognize, can lead to a range of different outcomes. In reality, there is a range of outcomes from cooperation to conflict and everything in between. So many documented instances of conflict can also be found, whereas many instances of cooperation can also be found. What we're kind of advocating for is a more critical approach that avoids very strong causal claims and instead acknowledges the spectrum, acknowledges that we are going to explicitly work on and nurture instances of peace, instances of opportunities for peace building, and use our voice at the Geneva Water Hub, use the platform that we have, the privilege that we have to advance this and to share lessons from this. And so it also has implications for the research that we'll be undertaking or that we already undertake. And most likely continuing to deepen our more qualitative research on water for peace. The next contribution is, it's really the title of our whole session today. It's about emphasizing the political nature of water for peace. So both water and climate change are deeply political issues. We need technical and political communities to come together and work on the issues together. And we do see this happening now with climate change slowly, and we think it's a good trend. We think it's important to continue shedding light on the political, social barriers to making progress. And again, for research, this has implications on the sort of things that we want to be looking at. We don't want to only be looking at kind of technical fixes. We want to really continue to look at social dynamics and also topics such as power. And it also means incorporating complexity into our work and for research. Absolutely, for research, that means methods that incorporate complexity. But for our other work on water diplomacy and what policy advocacy, it also means just listening well and making sure processes are inclusive, and letting all voices come to the table. And then finally, supporting local actors to build climate resilient water arrangements. So just to say this notion, the resilience is a term that really resonates with a lot of our work. And it resonates certainly in the water community, where there's been a long history already of working on climate resilience, and as well as the peace community. So the two kind of home communities that we work in. So it's not just about bouncing back to pre-existing states, but it's really about how it can evolve over time to be resilient to change. So I won't go into much detail here on this slide, just to say that these are some of the elements that we have already started exploring through our work, but will continue to in the coming years. And this is how we'd like to kind of work towards resilience in the communities where we work. So continuing to work on regional scale water resource planning, and I believe Mark will say a bit about that in a moment as well. Water diplomacy engagement, Natasha will make reference to this, through international law, which Mara and Tadesse will speak about in a moment. Water protection before, during, and after conflict, which my legal colleagues will also address, and applying an equity lens to decision making. And on this last point, I think we also have a lot to learn from the climate change community, who have been for a long time now advancing the notion of common differentiated responsibility, and who have been really driving this focus on needing to focus on fragile states. So I think there's as much learning to do from them as there is also contributions to make from our experience. So that is all from me, and I'm going to pass the floor over to Mara now. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Laura. So I now will share my my screen. Just a sec. So it is a pleasure to participate in this webinar, and in our presentation, given by myself and Tadesse, we are going to address a particular aspect of the climate change law. That it is the relationship between armed conflict and climate change. This is not a common topic, but as we will show, it is increasingly taken into account by international actors, and including states and international and non-governmental organizations. So this presentation will focus not only on this specific situation that is armed conflict, but will also focus on the legal aspect related to this particular situation. So in this first part, I will address the link between water, climate change, and armed conflict. My colleague Laura has already mentioned the situation of conflict, but here we are talking about a particular situation of conflict that is armed conflict. So where also it is applicable a specific legal regime that will be presented by Tadesse, that is international humanitarian law. So I would like to start by showing you a publication that was released a few days ago by the International Committee of the Red Cross, called Weathering the Storm, Reducing the Impact of Climate Risks and Environmental Degradation of People Enduring Armed Conflict. So this goes in the sense that I mentioned before, that there are organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross from the humanitarian side, but also environmental related organizations like, for example, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or also the UN Environment Assembly of UNEP, based, which has the headquarters in Nairobi, that have included elements of armed conflict in dealing with the issue of environmental degradation. However, in the field, in the arena of climate change, still the situation of armed conflict is play really a marginal role. So I think it is important to see how the International Committee of the Red Cross has embraced also this topic, releasing this publication also to be considered in the context of COP28. And here we can see that the call of ICRC, it is to scale up efforts to reduce the impacts of the climate and environmental crisis on communities, because in the context of armed conflict, communities are even more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So here we give some examples of the vulnerabilities of communities during armed conflict. Of course, we can imagine already communities are suffer during armed conflict, and the impacts of armed conflict worsen and amplify this situation of human suffering. Armed conflict also disrupt water infrastructure. We have seen this in the conflicts in Ukraine and in Gaza, and hinder also, so have also an impact on the management of shared water resources. So for example, we can mention the example of the destruction of the Novakavoka Dam in Ukraine, that also had environmental impact on the river. And so this also show that in recent armed conflict there has been really an increasing trend on using water as a weapon of war. So here now I would like to mention an initiative that has been taken by the presidency of COP28 to endorse a declaration on climate relief, recovery, and peace. So it is the first time that we have a document presented at COP, in a COP, that deal with the situation of peace and also on the situation of fragility and conflict. In fact, we can see here the call made by this declaration is the call to address the needs and the vulnerabilities of communities that live in a situation of armed conflict. We can see the sensitivity to include the word armed conflict. In fact, here in the declaration, there is only the mention of situation of fragility or conflict. So we don't see explicitly the word armed conflict, but we can argue that this call also it includes the situation of armed conflict, and also the declaration refer to the great needs of the communities living, the humanitarian needs of communities living in situation of armed conflict that are amplified by the impacts of climate change. So here, also in this in the COP declaration, I would like to highlight an element that has been integrated in the declaration, that it is the notion of conflict sensitivity. So what does it mean? It means that when we have projects related addressing climate change impacts, these projects that are funded in fragile countries that are in a risk of armed conflict, in this project cycle, the conflict sensitivity, the risk that this country where projects are developed, the conflict sensitivity and the particular political situation of the country must be taken into account. So this is an important topic an important element of the declaration to include the fact that also funders and international financial institutions should take into account in the project cycle the issue of conflict sensitivity. So now my last slide before giving the floor to Tadesse. This introduction that I gave is also the introduction to make the point that legal frameworks play an important role to protect people during armed conflict in a situation where climate change aggravate the human suffering of people. And so some elements of why legal frameworks are important includes the fact that, for example, international humanitarian law that is specifically addressed to the situation of armed conflict only contain few elements regarding the protection of water resources. On the contrary, as Tadesse will show, in international environmental law, in international water law, we have specific frameworks that can be used by states to protect freshwater resources, even in the context of climate change, complementing the norms of international humanitarian law. Another aspect are also related to the early warning systems. Often we think about early warning systems in the case of disasters, but the early warning systems can be used also in the situation of armed conflict, for example, when there is the risk of the pollution of a river. And then the last point, it is that we have in the international practice examples that cooperation on shared water resources also continued during the situation of armed conflict. An example that we often mention, the Geneva Water Hub, is the Senegal River Development Organization that continued to play a role even during the armed conflict between Senegal and Mauritania. And this river basin organization, like the ONDS, play a role as an agent for peace, and also, of course, include very often projects related to climate change. So here, through also river basin organization, we can see the link with climate change and peace, and also to improve the humanitarian situation of people. So many thanks, and I give the floor to Tadesse to continue the presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Mara, and thank you for the organizers. Mara, could you keep the slides and help me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And hello, everyone. I will begin by underscoring that the protection of water stands as a cornerstone for fortifying community resilience against the escalating impact of climate change. And this is particularly true in fragile and conflict-affected areas. The availability of water in that case may signify the difference between survival and peril. Hence, I think it is very important safeguarding water resources and infrastructure, which is of primary importance. What I am going to do now is to briefly shed light on the legal protections bestowed upon water resources and infrastructure under international law. First, I begin, Mara, the first slide. Yeah, so first I begin with the protection that we have under international humanitarian law. This law is applicable specifically to the context of armed conflict. And in that context, we have two layers of protection. So the first layer of protection is designated to the protection of special objects, one which includes objects containing dangerous forces like dams, which is relevant for the protection of water. And the other one is the protection of natural environment from widespread, long-term, and severe damage. So water is part of the environment, and protecting environment will help us address climate change. In that order, the special protections we have are really relevant in tackling climate change. And IHL also, under that special regime, provides a specific protection for objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, which includes drinking water, safe drinking water. And it also prohibits pillaging of natural resources. It also prohibits poisoning or using poisonous weapons. These things will exacerbate the impact of climate change, and prohibiting them will positively impact addressing impacts of climate change. In addition to these special provisions and protections under IHL, we have some general conduct of hostility rules, basically principle of distinction, which says do not attack civilian objects and civilian population. We have principle of proportionality, which prohibits attacking or causing disproportionate impact on civilians and civilian objects. We have the principle of precautions in attack that demands taking constant care to spare civilians and civilian infrastructure, including water facilities, from the impact of armed conflict. And finally, we have a principle of precautions against the effects of attack, which also require parties to the conflict to avoid locating objects in the vicinity of military objectives. These are really important because if we respect this rule, we protect resources and the environment, which ultimately enables the community to withstand with challenges of climate change. Next slide, Mara. Moving to the human rights aspect, currently we have a clear recognition of the right to access to safe drinking water and sanitation, and a right to clean and healthy sustainable environment as a human right. What this recognition entails basically is the obligation on states to respect, to protect, and of course fulfill their obligation. And these obligations also continue to apply mostly in situations of armed conflicts. What that does mean, it means they contribute in building community resilience to cope with climate change impact. And of course, we have some decisions by human rights bodies who are considering impacts of climate change as violations of human rights, including the right to life. So in that context, human rights law plays a significant role in addressing impacts of climate change. Next slide. Yeah, so now I will address the issues or the protections of environment that we have under international law. Since the UN Conference on Environment and Development, the Rio Earth Summit, we have the foundations for the protection of environment and addressing climate changes. And that was a pioneering conference where we have adopted important instruments, including the 1992 Rio Declaration and United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which are really important instruments for addressing challenges of climate change. And it has, under international environmental law, we have different principles which are relevant to address challenges of climate change. This includes the principle of prevention, the precautionary approach, polluter pays principle, principles of sustainability, principle of intergenerational equity, and the like. So these are all important for the protection of water, environment, and hence addressing challenges of climate change. Likewise, we have also rules under international water law. Under international water law, we have two global conventions addressing different aspects of water and use and the sustainable use of water resources. They recognize the prohibition of causing significant harm to the environment and the water resources. They also recognize the principle of reasonable and equitable utilization of shared water resources. They also recognize cooperation between states to address different challenges, water pollution, climate impact, and all that. And they also encourage parties to, or basin state sharing basins, to share some, to have some joint mechanisms to address, including climate impact. So some river basin organizations definitely now work on flexibility of their arrangements and agreements, and of course trying to address impacts of climate change, including drought and famine. I would like to emphasize that these legal frameworks complement each other. They do not operate in silos. And in conclusion, I would say to ensure a sustainable and equitable future for all, it is necessary to uphold this rule of law, adhere to the principles, and proactively pursue measures of implementation. Thank you all for your attention, and I will now pass the floor to Mark.
Thank you, Teresa. I'll just check you can all see my screen.
Yes.
So I want to build out a little bit more on the third pillar, or the third circle that Laura pointed out, the more critical one, which stems from political ecology ultimately, the one about underlying social vulnerabilities. I want to show it's deeply relevant to water diplomacy and for all of those who strive for peace. Peace in the broad sense, where issues are not swept away, but dealt with. Peace that must be fought for, in the words of Desmond Tutu. And the starting point of that kind of analysis is that environmental issues are political issues, and the two cannot be separated, which means that environmental analysts and diplomats who ignore the politics are not just missing an opportunity to resolve or partially resolve an issue, but actually doing some harm in some cases because they might be displacing or suppressing conflicts. Now, the corollary, where environmental analysts and diplomats who do take on the politics may actually change the world, but there are limits, clearly. So we're saying let's confront the politics, and how we do that is important. It must be intelligent, it's got to respect sensitivities, and sometimes it should be head on, and other times perhaps more indirectly. And this is one place I think the phenomenon of climate change and ideas like resilience can be useful. I'll exemplify through water in some tough neighborhoods like the Tigris and Euphrates and Gaza. So you've all seen the projections that suggest the rainy season in this part of the world is shifting, getting more intense. And there's clearly a lot of evidence that southern Iraq especially is drying up. Is it climate change or is it dams? Well, I mean, the good news is that it's dams primarily. Good news, because if we created the problem, then we should be able to fix it. But getting people around the table to discuss is tricky in this neighborhood. Suggestions to reallocate the water do not go down well with the basin hegemons. And yet the changes in climate are likely to continue to affect water availability throughout the region in a huge way, throughout the region. So perhaps the common threat can be, the fact that the threat is common can be used to encourage talks or maybe even cooperation over transboundary waters. And what we found is our recent research with the UNDP in Iraq, not just that Iraq is drying up, but it suffers more during the drought periods, more than its riparian neighbors, because the recharge rate of the reservoirs behind the dams is so much slower the further south you go. I mean, upstream reservoirs fill up more rapidly when the rains return. And the downstream reservoirs eventually fill up if there's enough rain at all. And so the downstream infrastructure is much less resilient. And resilience of the infrastructure affects, of course, people's ability to adapt and cope. And so while water is a sensitive topic, people certainly can and do talk about dust storms and regional desiccation, which are essentially climate change issues. So here, climate change can help to de-link temporarily the water and the politics for the moment, just to get to the table, where the politics will again have to mix with water. And the climate resilience transboundary water arrangements that Laura mentioned might be one pathway in here. So let's move to the West Bank, the Western Mediterranean, West Bank and Gaza, with particular focus on Gaza. And Gaza is different in every way to the Tigris and Euphrates. Really, the only water resource is the aquifer, which sustains far too many people following the forced displacement of Palestinians in 1948. 97 or 95% of the water doesn't meet drinking water guidelines of the WHO. I mean, it's undrinkable. And the World Bank analysis in 2009 found that the major obstacle to development of the water sector was the Israeli occupation. Importing even basic goods to build a desalination plant has long been problematic. And yet we were commissioned to do a study of projected effects of climate change. And so we assessed back in 2011. And so we assessed the risks associated with sea level rise or changes in precipitation next to those related to the Israeli siege and closure. And we found, of course, that the greatest risk was indeed the occupation. People in Gaza were much more worried about getting clean water and self-determination than, possibly a few millimeters less of rainfall or a slightly higher sea level rise. And the water authorities nonetheless persisted and built the infrastructure required for bulk water, and people developed the usual coping mechanisms like neighborhood level desalination plants. But then the research of people like Dr. Reem Abu Shomar discovered that AMR in the hospital and water and sewage was out of control. AMR is antimicrobial resistance, the superbugs. Those bugs which make antibiotics useless, which means that people can die of wounds just because they get infected because they can't be treated. And this is a sketch of the spread of AMR, how it affected people in 2021, just as COVID hit, but before the attacks in 2021. And here is an image of AMR under violent conditions, which happened later that year in 2021, not this year. And it gets, of course, that much messier. The pathways are very clear, easy to define, but very complex and very much more worse, basically because the sewage mixes with the drinking water system. But let's not look at sketches. Let's look at the people involved. Children shouldn't have to fetch water, especially if they're used to getting it at their tap. And now they don't even have enough to wash with because of the lack of electricity for pumping. And you have to imagine the spread of AMR now because it's untrackable. People like Reem can't do lab work when they're looking for water for their families. But we know that no sewage is being treated because of the lack of electricity. The aquifer is certainly becoming more contaminated with hospital waste, amongst other things. The situation is quite desperate. What do we draw from this? Well, the ideas like climate resilience are pretty much not relevant. In Gaza, we're bumping up against the limits of utility of climate change in environmental diplomacy. The timescales and immediate needs are just too different at the moment. But water is still relevant because it is an immediate need. And the question for those of us who are fortunate not to have to queue for our water is whether we give up on the situation and do and say nothing, or do you keep plugging away, stick to your principles and pivot to what's required, looking for political solutions, raising awareness, etc. I think too many have chosen the former, but silence isn't really an option if we're serious about building peace and about situating climate change within environmental politics for peace. The hush from the environmental or climate diplomacy community is deafening. We can let water reflect the roots of causes of the conflict and just how nonsensical it is to manage water separately in this tiny territory, and learn, for example, from the ICRC Weathering the Storm work that Mara presented, which links armed conflict and climate change. And so my last slide, just to conclude and rather quickly, how we address how we as environmental analysts and diplomats address and confront the politics must be intelligent and has to respect sensitivities. Sometimes it should be head on, other times indirectly is better, but we have to do it. And I'll pass over to my colleague Natasha now to explain one way that it can be done. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Mark. I'll probably want to share some slides, and I want to just go quickly, just give some elements of how basically we could put all of the, the research, all of the politics over all of the legal tools to use, because I would like to also give, the participants some time to ask some questions. So I want to share with you the work that I co-lead with another colleague of mine in terms of using water for peace diplomacy. In a way, we create these safe spaces for dialogue, particularly in fragile and conflict settings and across contact lines. And because of this linkage to the importance of water within this context and the devastating impacts of climate change, then these two elements, whether it's the water or the climate change, are perfect opportunities to engage on these kinds of safe space dialogues. But before I proceed, what do we mean by a safe space? What we facilitate as Geneva Water Hub is actually a space for dialogue that is defined through certain rules that are adopted in order to be able to overcome the sensitivity of certain topics that are either related to water management and sharing or politics, and with the objective of actually encourage open and frank discussions. These safe space dialogues are usually held under the radar, in the sense that the list of participants will not be publicized either on websites or social media, neither before, during, or after an event. These safe spaces also do not attribute any particular contribution from any of the participants without having, their prior consent. They follow the Chatham House rules. And one important thing is that within these safe spaces, all participants are equal. So no hierarchy or seniority exists within these safe spaces, and the participants are comfortable because there are no recordings of either the sessions or the discussions. So within that framework, what happens when, what is the objective of the safe space, and how does it relate to the climate change, and why is there a focus on fragile context and especially contact lines? Mara and has highlighted clearly what is the impact of armed conflict on vulnerable communities, including the weaponization of water, and the impact that it also has on the resilience, including resilience to climate. Now, over the past 2 decades, there's been a number of national conflicts that have actually led to the creation of different influence zones within the same political boundaries. And that's what I refer to as contact lines. So over the course of a certain conflict, the control of water facilities actually switches hands. The infrastructure is targeted, is vandalized, and then the maintenance and the repair becomes quite challenging. So on one hand, the same water network becomes suddenly in different influence zones, and the water supply from the source to the household or to the end user level is interrupted. And there we find a challenge in terms of water governance. And there's a need to actually have solutions that transcend the political agendas. So on one hand, we are limited by the political context, but on the other hand, and this is where water and climate change offer an opportunity, is that water resources and environment do not actually follow political boundaries. And the quality issues do not stop at what has now become a contact line. And the same applies, of course, for the devastating climate change related effects, including the earthquakes and floodings. So all of this to say is that within these contexts, there is an interest to actually explore solutions, whether they are related to water quality or water supply issues, beyond the limitation of the influence zones. And this is where we, with our partners at Geneva Water Hub, have been engaged in trying to actually bring together communities on both sides of the conflict, both sides of the contact line, in order to be able to come up with proposals that would ensure access to basic services and sanitation. One of the key success elements of the safe space dialogues is the ability to actually expand the perspectives of the people that are coming from both communities. And the other element is the ability to actually build the gradual trust and to utilize the capacity of technocrats that are usually liaised with the political leadership, that could come together, that could have a mutual thinking and longer term perspective, and that could build the kind of trust that has been eroded through the conflict. So I'll stop here because I really want to be able to see if we have any questions or observations or comments from the audience to myself or to, of course, any of my colleagues. If you have any questions, then kindly just put them in the chat. I'm trying to, at my end, I don't have anything. Sorry, I'm just looking at the chat. I can't see anything and I can't see any hands raised. So maybe in the next 5 minutes, I'll just have a round, with my colleagues. If anyone has any final words that we would like to share with the participants. Mark, Mara, Tadesse, Laura.
I'd be curious to see what anyone thinks about incorporating politics into their work, because it's easy to say, very difficult to do. If anyone has any experience that they would like to share, or thinks the other approach is better, where you just ignore the politics and only talk about the environmental issues, even temporarily, it'd be good to hear so we could all learn.
Just a second. No, I thought.
Yeah, just to add a question also to that of Mark. I'm wondering if among you there, maybe in your experience at COP, if the topic of armed conflict was never was sometimes discussed with other people, if it is included maybe in informal ways in the discussion there.
I think everyone is focused on all the news that's breaking from the COP, all the NDCs and GGAs that are being met, and the stopping of burning of fossil fuels and methane.
I can't see any reactions or any comments. I know there are people here that are working in the peace sector, so I think Mark's question is relevant, and I'm sure there are people also that have participated previously in the COP. but have 2 more minutes. So I don't know if Laura, you have any message or any also question from the academic side to the audience?
No, I mean, I think from the research side, we already are primarily social scientists using mostly qualitative research methods, but even there's a lot of diversity within that and the different approaches taken. And I think that's the way forward, is really trying to bring different methods and different perspectives together to focus on peace.
Thank you. Well, I think on behalf of myself and my colleagues at the Geneva Water Hub, also want to thank Katie and Impacts for organizing this important webinar series. And if anyone has any, follow-up or would like to, discuss any of the interventions that were made by myself and my colleagues, kindly feel free to reach out either, on our emails or through our LinkedIn. So back to you, Katie.
Wonderful. I do see a quick question in the chat from Alice, if anyone wants to quickly respond to it. I know we're running out of time.
What is it? Can you read it out, please?
Yes. At which level do you think it's easier to advocate for water cooperation to be an opportunity to peace? I work at the EU level, and it looks like it's a discussion happening at the local and international level, but not that much at a regional level.
I think I could take a stab at that. I mean, certainly it's easier at the local level. That's possible at the international level sometimes, depending on the neighborhood you live in. At the regional level, it's of course much more difficult, just bureaucracy-wise and logistically, but it can happen. And again, the example Mara Tedessa gave of in Senegal and in Western Africa, around the Guinea and Senegal rivers, the two regional organizations that do some really good work, really thinking beyond their own borders, and as well as in Southern Africa. So a lot to learn from Western and Southern Africa here.
Thank you so much, Mark. And thank you all again so much for attending. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.